Hello, everyone.
Okay, we'll give it about 30 more seconds and then we'll start. Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our fall 2020 symposium. So I want to thank everyone for being here this morning. We have a very special guest with us today, Aaron Wren, formerly of the Manhattan Institute. He's a nationally recognized author and speaker on transportation issues, currently based in Indianapolis. We also have a small panel of several local and out-of-town folks. So, I want to, again, thank everyone for being here this morning, and also just thank you for sticking with us, sticking with the RTLC during this very interesting time. I think as we look back over the last 6 months, several things jump out to me, and that is a growing realization, of course, that transportation and transit are essential. As we've seen throughout this entire pandemic crisis, just how central transportation issues are for getting our economy back on track and serving communities that need service the most. But transit, even before COVID, was in a state of tremendous change. And that change will only be accelerated with this current crisis. So we're very happy to have Aaron bring in his national level expertise for us today. And, now if this was an in-person event, this would be a great networking opportunity. But, we can still network here over Zoom. So please, I invite you, if you're comfortable, to put your contact information in the chat box so that people can get in touch with you. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat, and then I will field them to our panel and to our keynote, Aaron Wren. So with that, I'll hand it over to Aaron to get started on our keynote. And again, thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you. And I appreciate everyone joining virtually for this event. And I have to say how personally disappointed I am to not be able to be physically present in Milwaukee with you all today. I used to live in Chicago and would on occasion take the train up or drive up and go to Milwaukee. So I have been there. It's a great city to visit, and I was really looking forward to coming again until our world got turned upside down. So it's sad to have to do this virtually, but hopefully I will make it up there on the flip side. If we run into any network problems here, somebody just ping me on the panel and I can switch over to my phone. I know these panels sometimes have a alarming tendency to glitch just when you least need it. Today I'm here to talk about bus transit nationally and in Milwaukee. And I'm not going to say too much about rail transit, but that's not because it's not a worthy topic, but really today I just want to focus on the bus. And so first, I'm going to talk about the background trends in bus transit and in the country pre-coronavirus. Secondly, I'm going to talk about what the coronavirus has done to those trends and to bus ridership. And then third, I'm going to talk about how we reboot and rebuild the bus post-coronavirus. So first, let me share my, Dave, it's telling me I can't share the screen. Can you go down and see if you can enable screen sharing using the same mechanism we did before?
Sure, of course.
Okay, good. Hold on a second. Okay. Hey, Dave, could you do me a favor?
Yes.
Could you pull up the presentation and share it?
Yep.
Thanks. I'll just tell you when to advance the screen.
Okay. Can you
Sorry
make
about
me can you make me host again?
You are the host.
Okay. I think I just made you the host, but
Okay, hold on a second.
sorry for the glitches, everybody.
Okay. I don't see how to do that.
Okay.
Hold on a second. Yeah.
Okay. I got you, Aaron.
Okay, good. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Okay.
The first and most obviously relevant trend has been the decline nationally in bus ridership in the last few years. The New York Times recently did a piece called "The Mystery of the Missing Bus Riders," in which they looked at this topic. And this chart you see is one of the graphics that they put together, showing that in the last few years there's been a significant decline in bus ridership. There are only two. This is the 15 largest agencies in the country. There are only two that were really growing, and those are Seattle and the city of San Francisco. And put those aside for a minute, and we'll come back to them. They also created a kind of a closer up chart of just 4 cities clearly labeled, so you can see what's going on. We could advance: Portland, Atlanta, Minneapolis, and Miami. I think it's notable that, even Portland, a city with significant political commitment to public transit at the city and state level, has also seen the same trend. So this is not just that all these places decided to go in on the car. And how does Milwaukee fit into this picture? Well, the first thing I think it's important to do is to note that Milwaukee actually has a pretty high ridership city, certainly compared to its regional peer cities. For example, Milwaukee has 3 times the annual transit ridership of Indianapolis or Nashville. And so I think when it comes to the bus, you're actually doing very well compared to your regional peers. And that's important context to keep in mind, because if you have more bus riders, that makes the system more important. 3 times as many riders means it's 3 times as important, right? And so, but what is the trend in ridership? Again, if we take a look at the chart, we do see that ridership has also been down significantly in Milwaukee. You saw a decline of about 12 million annual bus rides between 2013 and 2018. So what caused this national decline in bus ridership across America? I don't think anyone knows for sure. The Times, that's why they called it the mystery of the missing bus rider. One theory that the Times floated was, in essence, gentrification. They noted that one city, I think it was Atlanta, had found that the neighborhoods that were whiter and had more people with college degrees suffered the biggest decline. I'm a little skeptical that that would be a problem here. Gentrification is really just a much less common phenomenon than is generally believed. The much more prevalent scenario is actually increasing concentrated poverty. In a think tank called the Economic Innovation Group out of Washington, it's a bipartisan group. They're the ones that developed the Opportunity Zone concept. They created an interactive map of the United States showing changes in neighborhood level poverty between 1980 and the present. And if we can advance the slide, we'll see this was their map of Milwaukee. And really the key to decoding this map is that essentially blue is gentrification, if you want to call it that, and the various shades of red and orange represent either persistent concentrated poverty or increasing concentrated poverty. So we can see that increasing concentrated poverty is really a problem in Milwaukee, but gentrification is pretty limited. We see this is very common, that there are really only a few downtown or near downtown areas that have seen a real influx of high income people that could be called gentrification. Another item that's sort of a trend in its own right and is often fingered as a cause of bus ridership declines is essentially the rise of new transportation services. So we can think of transport network companies like Uber and Lyft. We can think of micro-mobility solutions like electric scooters. We can even think of bicycling. And, I suspect there is some possibility that this might be affecting Milwaukee, but probably only at the margins. Uber Lyft is the favorite villain in New York City that people like to blame for a lot of their recent transit declines pre-coronavirus. I would gather that's probably kind of a marginal item at best for you. I pulled the statistics on Milwaukee bicycling. Bicycle commuting in Milwaukee is at pretty low levels and hasn't really been growing. And then things like electric scooters, are really more complementary to than substitutes for public transit because they enable that kind of last mile connectivity to and from transit. So possibly there's some marginal impact here. The finding that I found most interesting and maybe most compelling on transit ridership decline actually came out of Los Angeles. Los Angeles has been seeing a very severe decline in transit ridership. The Sierra Club just flat out said LA transit ridership is plummeting. And this was a city that a decade ago, people were calling the next great transit metropolis in America. They have a huge bus system. They've invested very heavily in rail. They have repeatedly raised sales taxes in order to invest in their system. I think there have been 4 major sales tax increases for transit since 1980. The most recent was in 2016. So the money has been there. They've been in investing, not a cutting mode. And yet there's been significant decline in ridership. So in 2018, the Institute of Transportation Studies at UCLA, which is an academic research institute, did an investigation and published a report on this decline. And they basically came to the conclusion that the primary culprit was increased car ownership. And this is one that I think does make sense to me. If we think back a decade ago, we were really still at the bottom of the Great Recession. 2010 was the worst year for unemployment in a lot of markets. And while we've seen a very slow recovery out of that compared to previous recessions, we had essentially a decade-long continuous expansion up to coronavirus. And that's, that brought us to record low unemployment. Even wages had started rising again. So it's certainly reasonable to think that people got more money and decided to use that to buy a car. So I decided to take a look at this when it comes to Milwaukee. First, I just looked at overall population growth, which has been really flat in Milwaukee County. I don't think that's really a driver, but we have seen some changes in vehicle ownership. Between 2010 and 2018, the number of households in Milwaukee County without a car declined by 2,500 or 1 point of share. And the number of households with only one car declined by 3,600 or 1.5 points of share. And those numbers don't sound big, but I did a little bit of back of the envelope math, and it's certainly plausible to think that those changes and increases in vehicle ownership may have accounted for a few million transit rides in the region. Again, not going to account for the entirety of it, but certainly could be a material contributor. Again, while increased car ownership is a negative from the standpoint of bus ridership, for those who are lower income, I think getting more money is a good thing. So I don't want to keep people poor so that they're forced to ride the bus. I want to make the bus the mode of choice. So I do think increasing car ownership after a decade-long expansion is a contributor. And then lastly, another one that people talk about is service cuts. And there's kind of a chicken and egg thing when it comes to service cuts. Did the service cuts cause the decline, or did the decline cause the service cuts? But it's certainly clear that you can end up in a declining service environment, and that creates kind of a downward spiral in which service declines perpetuate service cuts, which perpetuate declines, which perpetuate more service cuts. And so in Milwaukee, I wasn't able to fully understand, what the service environment here was. It sounds like there's been a lot of talk about service cuts. I'm not sure exactly how many of them have happened, but to the extent that you have any declines in service, not just routes being eliminated, but just even declines in frequency on routes, that is certainly going to have an effect on it. So probably some combination of all of these factors, as well as maybe others that we haven't identified yet, have been contributing to this decline. So decline in transit, the biggest trend nationally, and in Milwaukee in terms of the bus. So what else was going on in coronavirus, in America pre-coronavirus? I just want to rip through a few of these very, very, very briefly. The first was essentially increasing income inequality. And you see this chart. It's from the Census Bureau. It's of something called the Gini Index, which is the main measure people use of income inequality. All you really need to know about this chart is that the lines are going up. So we're becoming a more unequal society. We're also seeing middle class declines. In 2016, the Pew Charitable Trust did a study that found that of middle class household share, and in the majority of the metropolitan areas that they looked at, there had been a decline in the share of people in middle class income levels. That included Milwaukee. In 2000, 58.9% of households in Milwaukee Metro were middle class. By 2014, that had fallen to 52.6. So there was a fall of several points there. And most of that, almost all of it, was accounted for by people falling into lower income brackets. Only a very limited number went into the high income brackets. And again, this is sort of a national trend as well. And this inequality has increasingly spread to place. America hasn't really been bifurcating, but maybe has been trifurcating, if you will, into three basic kinds of communities. One is superstar cities like New York and San Francisco on the coast. The second is Sunbelt boomtowns like Austin and Nashville. And the third is sort of very struggling cities, often post-industrial, like Youngstown and Flint. And there are large numbers of cities in America, like Milwaukee, like Indianapolis, where I am, that don't fit cleanly into these categories. But I think this divergence between places that are successful and places that are unsuccessful is started occurring in the country. And it's also occurring at the neighborhood level, as you know. And then, of course, there are long-standing divisions along racial lines. I'll just briefly highlight segregation because, as many of you are surely aware, Milwaukee has been ranked as the most segregated metropolitan area in the United States. On the screen, you'll see a map that a gentleman named Eric Fisher out of San Francisco put together based on the 2010 census, showing where people of different races live. The red dots indicate white residents, the blue dots indicate black residents, the yellow indicates Hispanic. I think Asian is green, but there aren't very many Asians in the region. And so you see here like extreme segregation in Milwaukee. Again, there's plenty of company here in terms of very strong levels of segregation, especially in the Midwest. And then there's another kind of division that's been ongoing, and that's social and political division. And I'll just be honest, as an outsider, the partisan divides in Wisconsin are starker and more acrimonious than what I see in basically any other state in the Midwest. And you can just see it on a map when you look at elections. I just want to put up the next map. This is a election map of the 2016 election at the precinct level that the New York Times put together. And you can basically see the Milwaukee County line without any sort of special emphasis on it. So you can see there are very stark geographic divides to these voting polarizations as well. And so all of these are things that I would classify as trends of division, divisions in income, divisions in place, divisions by race, divisions by social or political orientation. And so we've sort of seen the country kind of pulling apart on multiple dimensions. So those are sort of the pre-coronavirus trends. What has happened with the coronavirus? Obviously, it's been a big disruption to our country. It has accelerated some of the trends that were pre-existing in place. I think notably, for example, of the Black Lives Matter protests that have been going on across the country, kind of showing the fruits of some of the business as usual on race. You can also think of income inequality. Some people are saying that we're having this what's been called a K-shaped recovery, where you have one line sloping up, which is people with college degrees and the higher income workers. You know, that some people are saying, hey, the recession's over for high income workers. They're already back to normal if working remotely. And then there's a downward sloping line for people without degrees at the lower end of the economic spectrum, where there have been millions of job losses. There's increasing food insecurity and a tremendous buildup of potential evictions once these moratoriums are lifted. But not every trend has proven to be an acceleration. One thing I didn't mention that was going on pre-COVID was a really kind of a downtown boom. I mean, downtowns were on a roll. It was really an era of the downtown renaissance. Cities like Milwaukee were seeing large amounts of residential construction in downtown. Visitors were up. There were more and better restaurants than ever before. The cultural amenities were getting better. There were even job growth in many downtowns for the first time in a long time, as industries like technology increasingly came to prefer an urban location over suburban locations. But the coronavirus was really like a punch in the face to American downtowns. Central business districts, downtowns in America are essentially dead right now because of their two main drivers being put in the deep freeze. One is sort of hospitality writ large. So you can think about tourism, conventions, et cetera, that drive restaurant patronage, cultural institution patronage, et cetera. People aren't traveling. We're doing this event virtually, for example. And then there's the white collar workforce, which is almost entirely on work from home right now. And so, and there's some questions about whether that white collar workforce will actually come back at the same levels, or whether there will be a structural shift towards more remote work. And this has obviously had a huge impact on transit ridership, because transit is very downtown oriented, essentially everywhere. And, I mentioned that, Seattle and San Francisco earlier and said I would circle back with them. Why was their transit ridership, their bus ridership growing? Well, the cities were growing in population, but a more important factor is that they were both seeing large increases in downtown employment because of the tech industry. Think about Seattle, where Amazon went from 0 to 40,000 employees. And then just think of all the other businesses that exist around Amazon as well. So when your downtown is seeing mass high value employment growth, you see large increases in transit ridership. And so no surprise, with the pandemic and concerns over social distancing, with the white collar world on work from home, with much of the hospitality sector operating far below capacity, bus ridership, transit ridership has gotten clobbered across America. I saw a report that in May, Milwaukee bus ridership was down 70% from its normal value. I'm sure it's likely improved somewhat since then, but that's still a big decrease. But to tell you the truth, that's actually better than a lot of places. This is one where some of these very large cities, particularly ones with commuter rail lines, have seen truly stunning drops in ridership. At peak fall, Chicago's metro system, for example, was down 97%. So they were basically running totally empty trains. They're still down 90%. It's a big deal for them. But nevertheless, these declines are a real problem for public transit agencies, because a decline in ridership means a decline in fare revenue, which is causing financial problems for some of these institutions. And this is one where Milwaukee and places like it are actually in a much better shape than some of these really big city agencies like the New York MTA or Chicago. In those huge systems, fare revenue is a very significant source of operating funds. I've seen some reports that have estimated that the New York subway essentially pays for its own operations through fares, for example. And that's just much less true in other cities. Fare and other earned revenue in Milwaukee was about 27% last year. I think fares were budgeted at 23% of the operating budget this year. So Milwaukee is less vulnerable financially to an immediate loss of revenue from fares. Now, that doesn't mean that state aid or local taxes are not going to take a hit. They are. But the immediate loss of fare revenue from ridership declines is less acute here than it is in other places. And that's particularly true in light of the CARES Act, which was the federal legislation that provided for coronavirus relief that gave money to transit agencies to help bridge them through this. I think Milwaukee got around a third of its annual budget in support, which is very good. The bus system here got a good chunk of money. Again, the much bigger systems have blown through it essentially already. And they are facing dire financial circumstances if there's not another government aid package soon. And by the way, for everyone in Milwaukee, you can assume that those big agencies are going to be very aggressively lobbying to make sure they get a much larger share of any future package. So that's something for you to be fighting for your fair share of it. So put this together, and I think it's very obvious that we need to be able to rebuild and reboot the bus system in America. We needed it pre-pandemic with all of these trends. We need it post-pandemic for sure. And if you think about all those trends around division, the bus, I would argue, is a key tool that we can use to try to bridge some of those divisions. For example, connecting lower income labor pool with emerging job centers in the region. Transit has a big role and an important role to play. So it's imperative that we figure out how to come out of this and reboot. So how do we do that? And this is where we get to the actual, I would hope to be the fun part of the presentation. I feel like what I've been saying so far is kind of a downer in terms of the trends that are out there. It can be depressing to think about it, but there's actually a lot of good news in transit. And so what I want to do is share some things that other cities, kind of regional peer cities in the Midwest, were doing pre-coronavirus to try to address the challenges of declining bus ridership and kind of to take their transit systems to the next level. So I'm going to look at Indianapolis, Columbus, Ohio, and Kansas City. And all of these systems, are going to have to go through their own rebuilding process to be sure, but they were already making significant moves pre-pandemic, some of which that I think could be very applicable to Milwaukee. And first, I want to talk about Indianapolis, and it's not just because I live there right now, but because they've made some very impressive investments in transit. Now, Indianapolis is starting from a low base, to be sure. There are about 9 million annual bus riders in Indianapolis. That's basically the lowest of any major city in the United States. Less than 1% of regional commuters ride transit. So this was a city with nowhere to go but up. But that could have been used as an excuse to just ignore transit, but instead the city took stock and decided to try to change the situation. And it started back in 2009 with the creation of something called the Central Indiana Transit Task Force, which convened civic leaders across the region to develop a program to improve public transit and then push for implementation. And there was a bumpy road to getting this implemented. In order to raise the tax revenue necessary to pay for the system, it was necessary to get state legislative approval for a referendum. And the city-state divide in Indiana is certainly less acute than it is in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. On the other hand, Indiana is a far more conservative state than Wisconsin, particularly when it comes to spending money. And so it took 3 years to actually get that passed through the legislature, but it finally was passed. And then there was a referendum to raise income taxes by 0.25% locally in order to fund this program, which was passed on the first attempt. So where did the money go? Where is it going? First was simply to significantly increased the level of bus service in the city. There's just no substitute for service levels. Running more buses more frequently, longer hours of service, more routes, et cetera. So just flat out more service was part of it. But the city did redesign its entire bus network, something that a lot of places are doing. I believe Milwaukee is in the process of doing it. Jarrett Walker and Associates out of Portland, which has done a number of these, did the Indianapolis plan. And like many of them, it involved more focus on higher frequency trunk routes versus lower frequency coverage routes. But I think the interesting situation here is, unlike a lot of places that have done bus network redesigns, Indy was actually in a service growth environment. It wasn't like it was like a fixed pool of money and we're sort of having to have winners and losers as we reallocate it. So in essence, I think most people were able to end up being winners here. One of the things that's coming out of this, for example, is that every bus now runs 7 days a week, something that was not the case before. So this bus network was planned to be implemented over the summer. I don't know that they fully implemented it yet, but this is in the process of implementation. The transit program also involved building a 3-route bus rapid transit, or BRT, network in the region to service the central spine of the new transit system. BRT is essentially a form of enhanced bus service that is designed to replicate many of the advantages of rail. And so why did Indianapolis decide to go with BRT over light rail? Well, it was actually very simple. The state prohibited the city from building light rail, so there was no choice. But as we will see, it turned out that BRT was extremely capital efficient in Indianapolis. It even really surprised me how capital efficient it was. There's a lot of variability between BRT systems, between cities. It's a kind of a very nebulous phrase in some respects. So I'll tell you a little bit about what it includes. First, it includes light rail type stations with nice canopies, maps, fare machines, intercoms, all of that. There's level boarding, where you can simply walk on and off the bus without having to navigate any steps. This is particularly speeds up the boarding processes. For example, when you have someone with a wheelchair, there's no need for a ramp or a lift. You just roll on the bus, roll off the bus when you need to exit. The stations, I think, turned out very nice. They're very attractive. You see on your screen a picture of one there. It was a result of an architectural competition that turned out very well. And one of the nice features of these is that there's an integrated snow melt system, so you don't actually have to shovel or salt the platforms in the winter. There's also off-board fare collection with proof of payment. So what that means is, rather than everybody lining up at the door to put quarters in slot or show their pass to the driver, you buy a ticket or buy a pass before you board the bus, and then you just get on through any door you want. These are articulated buses. There's 3 doors per side, or 2 doors only on the driver's side. You just get right on and get off when you're done. And then periodically a fare inspector, who in Indianapolis is a transit worker, not a police officer, by the way, will come through and check tickets, do spot checks to make sure people paid. They've checked my tickets. I've never seen anyone who didn't have a ticket, so it seems to be doing pretty well. So it's sort of an honor system with verification. And again, it speeds up boarding, really speeds up boarding, particularly when there are a lot of people waiting to get on the bus. But probably the most important element of this is dedicated bus-only lanes. It doesn't matter how fast you can get on or off the bus if the bus is stuck in traffic. And so there won't be 100% dedicated lanes for the BRT system, because just the streets in many cases aren't wide enough to support it. But a majority, I think a significant majority of the route is going to include lanes that are bus-only dedicated lanes for BRT, and traffic signal priority at at intersections, so we'll give the bus priority over cars at traffic lights. So what's the status of this? You can see a picture of an actual bus there. The north-south red line, which is about 13 miles, is open for business. You can ride it right now. The purple line to the northeast is fully funded and in final design. It may start construction next year. And then the blue line, which is east-west, is going to be, it's in the preliminary design phases and will be built last. And what I think is very notable about these BRT lines, again, is how capital efficient they are. The red line was $96 million to build, but of that, the federal government paid $77 million. So the feds paid for 80% of it. This is pretty rare in my experience in America today. It's tough to get 80% now. The rest of the lines are budgeted at 50%, and the purple line has already been awarded federal funding at that level. We found out about that, I think, the same way you found out about getting funding for your East-West BRT, which was via a Trump tweet. But be that as it may, we did get it. You know, maybe you could stop sharing the screen. This is the last slide, and then people can just see me. You know, although I do like that. Transit station. I think they're just really great stations here. At full system build out, Indianapolis is going to have 62 miles of BRT with 97 stations at a price of $500 million. And if it gets the federal funding at the level it anticipates, which it has already done for the first two phases, the local share of that is only going to be $220 million, which is ridiculously cheap as these things go. Think about, you know, 62 miles, 97 stations for only $200 million. That's very important in a conservative state like Indiana. But even that, I think, doesn't tell the full tale of this, because a lot of the cost, most of the cost of BRT really going to basic infrastructure improvements, things like drainage improvements, curb and sidewalk repairs, new sidewalks, new traffic signal controllers and traffic signals that have all the sophisticated computerization needed for bus prioritization, even straight up paving the system. The purple line, for example, is adding sidewalks to 6 miles of street that don't actually have them today. And so, I mean, my basic kind of rough estimate is that the city is probably spending $200 million of its own money on desperately needed infrastructure improvements that it already needed to make anyway, and is essentially getting a BRT system thrown in for free. So I think this has been really good. You know, and the red line played a role in where my family chose to live. When we moved back from New York City in December, we got a place close to a red line stop, and we are a one-car family. And, you know, in pre-COVID, we were riding it. Now, I admit I haven't been riding it since the COVID breakout, although my wife actually got unsolicited, says she was thinking about taking our son down on the bus to a park later this week. But I'm sure we will be back on it after there's a vaccine, et cetera. We're back in the office. And the red line has made riding transit in Indianapolis a viable mode of choice for the first time in decades. And you see that in the cross-section of the community I see riding it. Now, I will definitely tell you the rollout of the red line was far from problem-free. There were a lot of problems, but I think we're mostly past it. And I think it's really been a great system. And I say I've ridden a lot of buses in my life, and I think it's a great transit system. So Indy essentially replaced its entire transit system. It's in the process of replacing its entire bus system. It increased funding, redesigned the network, rolling out a 3-line BRT network. It also did other things. It's replacing its old fare system with a new one that's going to include technology like fare capping. What that means is rather than having to buy a pass in advance, you just pay cash for fares. And once you hit the threshold of a pass value, it automatically converts you into a pass, and all your future rides are free for that week or that month or even that day. It's a really interesting system. And then also there was a new downtown transit center. So there was a lot. And it's not to say that it was perfect. I mean, there are definitely some things that I would have liked to have seen. The original plan was to extend the system into surrounding counties. But because of the funding structure, that will have to be done in future phases. But really the core system needed to be upgraded anyway. And some suburban counties are already tapping into it. There's a community just west of Indianapolis that has a massive industrial distribution area. they created a special taxing district to fund shuttle buses that connect to the city bus system at the end of the line. It's the line that's going to be converted into the Blue Line BRT, and taking people to work in those warehouses. So I think there's a lot of ways to go ahead and start tapping into it. Another city that's really doing some interesting things is Columbus, Ohio. Now, Columbus started with better bus ridership than Indianapolis. They had about 2x Indy's ridership, less than Milwaukee, but certainly much better than Indy. And they've really been trying to focus on transport innovation. Some of you may be aware that they won a nationwide competition for a $50 million Smart Cities grant from the U.S. Department of Transportation. So that was a big win from them. They're also doing some interesting things with microtransit. The thing I want to highlight here is a program they created called the C-Pass. So like a lot of cities, they had a special downtown service area taxing district. And they used that taxing district to get free bus passes free to the employee for anyone who worked in that taxing district. So if you work in downtown Columbus, Ohio, you essentially get a free bus pass. And it might seem that like the cost of a bus pass was really not going to be a barrier to people riding transit. I mean, the fares, how much is it? Maybe you save on parking. But as it turned out, it made a big impact. I saw the estimate is that the share of downtown workers commuting by bus went from 5% before this program to 10 to 14% afterwards. And while they did aggressively market it, I think the lesson to take away from this is never underestimate the motivating power of free. And I saw this in reverse in Louisville, Kentucky. Louisville, Kentucky built 2 new automobile bridges across the Ohio River. And for local residents with a transponder who commute every day, the toll was $1. So it wasn't a huge toll. And yet, when these bridges opened, tens of thousands of commuters rerouted themselves away from the now tolled bridges onto the remaining free bridges in order to avoid that. It was kind of a debacle for them, quite frankly. And I think it shows that you can drive significant changes in behavior with relatively low amounts of money. And I think the Columbus experience brings up a really interesting question, which is, why are these smaller cities even charging fares on the bus in the first place? Again, in New York or Chicago, they raise a ton of money from fares. The fares are really paying for a lot of the system. And their system is very crowded at peak periods. They couldn't just take unlimited passengers on it anyway. But most transit agencies just don't get that much money from fares. They're already paying for the majority of the system through taxes. So why not just go ahead and raise the taxes a little bit more and get rid of the fare? Collecting fares actually costs money. You have to have all the fare collection equipment. You have to have all the software. You have to do all the cash handling. It slows you down when people board the bus. Or if you go proof of payment, you have to end up, with all these fare inspectors. So you're actually cost you money to collect fares. And again, in these cities where have very low fare box recovery, bus riders are primarily low income. So we're in essence putting a highly regressive tax on low-income residents by charging them fares, which I think is kind of crazy. I think charging fares is something we do because we've always done it. Maybe a legacy of when these were privately funded for-profit streetcar lines way back in the day or something, but we are way past that era. And so for all these reasons, I have long been of the view that it just does not make a lot of sense to charge fares for the bus in many of these Milwaukee class cities. And one place that seemed to have come to the same conclusion was Kansas City. Kansas City launched a very successful streetcar, maybe the most successful streetcar in the country. It's one of the rare streetcar projects that dramatically exceeded its projected ridership levels. And one reason for that was when they built it, the financing model included operations. So you end up with, a system that was free. And so people were riding it was free. And they said, hey, maybe we could get similar results if we made all the buses free too. So they voted to eliminate fares on the entire bus system in the Kansas City area. Now, I'll admit I'm not 100% sure how that played out with the coronavirus. There's no fares being collected right now, but I'm not sure that they finally crossed all the T's, dotted all the I's in terms of permanently eliminating fares. And in the current fiscal environment, we'll see. I know someone from Kansas City is supposed to be on later, so I'm just saying I'll let them speak definitively in terms of what's going on there. But the fact that a city, a big city, similar size to Milwaukee, like Kansas City, is doing something like this, I think is very important and impressive. And it would have been great to see what this would have done to bus ridership, but unfortunately with the coronavirus, ridership comparisons are going to be out the window for a while. The pushback I always get about fare elimination is that, hey, fares are needed to keep homeless people from basically moving into the bus. And my view is, well, homeless people need to get around too. Certainly appropriate for a homeless person to ride the bus, but I do think it's the case that buses are designed for transportation services, not to serve as de facto homeless shelters. So this is one that I think there has to be some sort of a plan around in terms of building public support, because again, it's the thing that I have heard on it. But I think that fareless is a really very interesting idea. So to sum this up, Indianapolis, Columbus, Kansas City were all in their own way making moves to try to improve their bus system through increases in service and reductions in price. And again, all three of them are going to need to, reboot and refactor their bus system post coronavirus. But they were already, this was already happening against a backdrop of investment in the system. And I think a lot of this is applicable to Milwaukee. And I think the good news is Milwaukee's already doing some of this stuff. I believe you're already redesigning your transit network, which will hopefully get approved. You're already making moves on BRT with the East-West BRT. I think that this is one where there's huge opportunities. If a city like Indianapolis, which has a third of Milwaukee's transit ridership, can build a 3-line BRT network, there's no reason a city like Milwaukee can't have a complete network of BRT systems. And frankly, it might be a way to, finance a lot of infrastructure improvements that you already need to be making anyway. I think, the thing I would really be looking at, just a few thoughts. One is you gotta do everything in your power to avoid service cuts. I mean, service cuts can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think we're going to be entering into a service cut kind of era with coronavirus, but this is something I think to try to push back and avoid if you can. Unlike Indianapolis, you already have a very strong core system. So are there ways to better link your bus system into the surrounding counties? Might be challenging to do. Serving those suburban areas is not necessarily easy. It will probably require some experimentation to get the right model. But something that could potentially be done. And then the thing I would just throw out there, is it possible to start taking some steps towards, making transit free? I mean, that's like a real game changer for the bus. And again, it seems like a radical idea, but most other government services that we consume are free. So I think it's interesting. Obviously, all this stuff costs money. We're in a very tight fiscal environment right now. We're in a very difficult political environment right now. But I think this is where all these cities, have to be able to navigate through that in order to, again, rebuild, defend, expand bus systems, which are so critical to the economy and bridging so many of the other social problems that we have. So I wish you the best with that. I'm a huge fan of Midwest cities. And, I live here in the Midwest, and I really hope you were able to navigate through and beyond this very difficult time. So with that, I'll wrap it up and turn it back to you, Dave.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for your information and your perspective. Now, we do have a small panel, and I'll introduce them kind of one after another, and then we'll dive right into the discussion. We have David Johnson joining us from Kansas City, Missouri, beaming in through the magic of Zoom today. David does have to scoot at 9 a.m., so I'm going to start off with him. But before we do that, we also have Mike Zabel from HNTB urban planner who's worked heavily on the East-West BRT project, and Jacqueline Zeledon from the Milwaukee County Transit System, community outreach and internal communications, community outreach manager and internal communications coordinator. Since David, you have to bounce, and we did have some brief overview of what's happening in Kansas City. If you could speak a little bit further about what Aaron had talked about some of the changes that you've had down there, both vis-a-vis the fare box, the free fares, and also the some of the services that you're providing in more of the outlying areas, you know, around your region, around things like microtransit and other on-demand services. So, David, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for the invite, and good morning, everyone. And thanks for that great lead-in, Aaron. Nice to be considered with those great peer cities. And as you pointed out, we actually weren't in a growth mode. And so I wouldn't say that the zero fare effort was an act of desperation, but we looked at the cost of collecting revenue and the price of replacing our 20-plus-year-old fare collection system, which is, you know, completely closed and mechanical and difficult to maintain, especially after that lengthy lifespan. And said, why bother spending another $12 or $15 million on a proprietary system that will also be mechanical and closed, and just eliminate all that friction in boarding. So even if you don't agree with the fundamentals of zero fare or not charging a fare to use this public service, think about the friction that charging a fare creates on every system in the world. So whether it's a turnstile at the sort of high end, or just putting cash or any paper media or electronic media or interacting with some sort of fare collection equipment, that slows boarding. And so it also creates equity problems. And that's why fare capping is now very trendy, because people are desperate to find a way to make fare collection systems more equitable. Because the basic fundamental is, if you can afford a $50 or $100 bus pass, you get unlimited access. If you cannot scrape that money together, you pay per trip and you pay more. So it is a huge equity issue. And because these systems are so proprietary and closed, especially if they're older, you're unable to do fare capping unless you do a massive technology upgrade. So we just said, screw that, and let's just make the service free, because there's some other things playing against transit in Kansas City, very similarly in Columbus, Milwaukee, and other US cities that are not New York or San Francisco, is the car. And access to vehicles, cheap driving, low congestion. We have basically no urban congestion in Kansas City. Ironically, our streetcar streets were wide and had plenty of space. And so we actually rarely request bus lanes because they simply don't provide a travel time increase. And the argument about removing street parking seems kind of worthless when you're not going to get an actual travel time benefit outside of downtown, of course. So anyway, zero fare was really an equity play for us, but it has other benefits operationally for us. Fare collection is actually in my department, and so I no longer will have to hire someone to run pass programs, order paper media, or just manage that process. And I don't have to pass that on to our community partners. We're actually a bi-state agency in Kansas and Missouri, and so local governments contract with us for service, and we pass those direct costs onto them as part of our contracting. So we'll be able to eliminate that cost. We do expect zero fare to increase ridership. Of course, that was before the pandemic, and we suspended our fare collection regionally because of public health concerns. So our union was actually a leader in pushing this, and that's why many agencies, I think, across the United States gave up on fare collection from a public health perspective, because it increased the interaction between passengers and the operators. And the operators, of course, are essential workers, and with no operator, you can't run service. So we actually had implemented barriers on 100% of our fleet last year and made use of it mandatory. We think that's one of the main reasons our staff has been hardly affected at all by the pandemic. We've had 5 positive cases, possibly 6 this week. since the pandemic hit Kansas City. Other agencies have fared much worse, and all of our contact tracing has indicated those transmissions occurred off campus and not in the workplace. So we've been very, very lucky, but I think a lot of it has been the implementation of those barriers, and you're seeing agencies across the United States now implement barriers so they can get back to fare collection because of the revenue loss and reinstitute front door boarding. We're actually going to probably reinstitute front door boarding just because it's had a performance impact on our system. There isn't as much space at the rear door for customers to get on and off through the same entrance. And so we're revisiting that and probably will reinstitute front door boarding, but not fare collection through the end of this year. It is important to note that our core city, Kansas City, Missouri, did make the policy statement on zero fare and sort of directed us to go down that path, but we had been talking about it for some time. And we even had our local university study the economic impact. And there's every indication that that money, even though it's $1.50 per trip, the people that are using the system today would circulate that through the local economy 3 times rather than just letting it sit in our agency and go into outside vendors for fare collection and maintenance of that system. So there's an economic argument for zero fare. We use the words zero fare to indicate that it's not a free ride because locally our taxes are sales taxes that support transit. And so as Aaron indicated in his comments earlier, essentially we were taxing those our customers twice, once at the register, local registers for sales taxes, and another when they entered the system. And that in essence was also inequitable. So those are all the sort of logic we used. There was some convincing, especially with our suburban partners who feel that transit is a sort of an afterthought, to be honest, and that everyone should pay for government services that cost. But I think we're making inroads there, and we actually started a private sector fundraising effort to offset their fare loss. We actually have 5 separate systems that are governed and funded separately. They all operate under the same brand. So we've had to have this conversation 3 times, actually. So we were easy to convince. The streetcar that you mentioned, which had fare free built into its operating plan from the beginning. And then our 3 suburban systems needed some convincing because of the revenue loss, and they didn't have the opportunity for someone to come along and give them additional funding to offset that revenue loss. We were 10% fare revenue in our overall operating budget, so that's a relatively small lift. And with our small ridership, for about 14, 15 million trips a year, that was only about $8 million for the system that we actually operate, and a little bit larger amount for the region at large. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions or pass you off to someone else so I can head to my other meeting. Sure. I can still answer questions in the chat box if anybody has them. I'll stay on the Zoom with my video off in case anyone has follow-ups. So thanks for including me today.
Great, thank you, David. Okay, so other panelists, if you could reconnect with us. So, we've talked a lot about zero fares. We've learned a lot from Kansas City. We've seen what Indianapolis has done to really kind of go from some of the lowest transit ridership in the United States to, advance along towards a more transit-friendly city by embracing bus transit. So, and we have a number of questions specific for Aaron, which, in the chat box, but which I will get to as our panel kind of goes along here. But, I wanted to kind of bring it down to the user level. And, a number of us here on the call, Mike, Jacqueline, we've been in many community meetings. We've talked with community members, and in the context of the data that Aaron had just presented to us, what do riders, what do 21st century riders and potential riders, people that are not yet riders, what do they want? What do they want and expect from their transportation services? So that's kind of a general question, but just interested in the panel's reactions to that.
Good morning.
Morning. So either
My
Mike or
initial
Jacqueline.
instinct on that first question, I think Aaron hit on it immediately when he was discussing the Indigo improvements, is that the frequency of the service is of the utmost importance. If you need to be to your job in 15 minutes and you know that the bus is going to be there, that's a great example. Here for the city of Milwaukee, for instance, there's a lot of great technological tools that are linked to the buses and knowing when they're coming, and in order to get to where you need to be, that's of the utmost importance, and I think users really appreciate that.
Yes, and I'd like to add to what Mike just shared, that yes, definitely people are interested in our service, service times being more frequent and being reliably predictable too. And I think they're also searching for routes, or not searching, but rather would prefer to have routes that are major connectors to job centers, essentially where they need and want to be, especially with emerging job centers where new jobs are being added by the thousands, and people, they are needing to be from point A to point B, especially with you have job deserts to where you have the jobs valley. And that's something that definitely going forward that we all need to make sure that we increase and let people know that it's there. And I think on the environmental aspect, they also, we have customers who seeking to decrease their carbon footprint, if you will. So we're also adding things like electric buses that will provide fewer fuel emissions and also a quieter and cleaner ride.
Great, thank you. Mike and Jacqueline, could you give us a very brief status update for some of the major improvements that we've touched upon? So the East-West BRT, as we saw, we did see a presidential tweet in June about that, which really kind of elevated that, public, the public consciousness. And then also coming around the pike here, the MCTS Next bus system redesign. So either one of you, if you could just kind of give me a status update as to where those initiatives are right now and what we can expect in the near term on those.
Okay. Well, I know that we're working with...
Maybe if you want to start just kind of the bigger picture of Next, and then I could get into a little more details about the BRT.
We're right there. We're right there, Mike. Right. Yes. With MCTS Next, that is our recommended route system, and we have been working on that for the past few years. It had a lot of community input, because essentially our route system has been in place for like 50 plus years, and just think of all the things that have changed within that time span, especially in terms of where people are living and where people are working, where they're shopping. And so we've taken some steps to have a way to have faster service, more connections, and increased access through MCTS Next. And that involves additional high-frequency routes like our Red Line and Gold Line. It also includes having routes in areas where maybe there wasn't the best service, but improving it, especially within some of our more central areas where we have a lot of traffic congestion. So now we have routes that will compete, if you will, for people's attention in terms of giving them a better option rather than in the car with via MCTS Next. So last week, Milwaukee County Board of Supervisors, Transportation, Public Works, and Transit Committee, they approved our plan to go to the board. So next week, the Milwaukee County Board of Supervisors, they will vote on our recommendations. And then if approved, MCTS Next will start getting things moving forward with that in terms of for 2021. And that will involve a lot of public outreach and education to let people know what to expect and how the routes will improve their travel. And in terms of East-West BRT, like you said, it was approved in federal funding in June, and Mike and his group, they have been instrumental in helping us with those plans. And again, we talk about connecting people to major job centers. We have a 9-mile stretch from east end of Wisconsin Avenue all the way out to the Milwaukee County research grounds, and we have schools and institutions, a lot of jobs that way, and it will be having major connectors. And so I'm going to let Mike take it from there, and in terms of major connectors from other major routes connecting with the BRT, and you know, it's just going to be a game changer here in the Milwaukee area.
Yeah, indeed. And just that's a great summary overall of where BRT fits into MCTS. But just for an overview for anyone that that doesn't know a whole lot about our project, it started in 2016 and really got kicked off through Sewer Pack and their regional transportation plan, and looking for those spines or those corridors that could really benefit from this type of service. Right now, similar to Indigo, we're getting a small starts grant agreement that would pay for about 80% of the capital cost for the project, and we're jumping through the hoops and coordinating with the federal government at this time to execute that small starts grant agreement, as referred to in May by President Trump and ultimately appropriated by Secretary Chow the day after. So it's a really exciting opportunity for Milwaukee. And once again, pulling from your example, Aaron, of Indigo, you know, I know the pieces are in place to start looking at what the other connecting services are. So whether that connects to the Milwaukee streetcar at a downtown transit plaza somewhere in the future, looking at a north-south transit enhancement, connecting to all the other transit services that are within Milwaukee. One other thing I wanted to touch on for the BRT system and how it was planned, there's the whole planning process is a fairly amazing thing to look at. Where residents live, where businesses are, where existing MCTS services are, what changes are going to be made to that, and how we can most efficiently and effectively connect to those different services. So it's been a great opportunity to really help the MCTS next endeavors and make those connections and more or less help redesign the system.
Great, thank you. Those of us that are in the transportation business, we're familiar with the term the last mile problem. And for those on the call that aren't familiar with that term, I mean, that's essentially the difficulty that we have in long distances walking to get from a bus stop to a final destination. And of course, that is a bigger issue in the kind of sprawled out suburban sprawl that we have. Now, earlier on the call, we did have David Johnson from Kansas City, and Aaron, I know down in Indy, there's been a number of newer or newish approaches to this problem. Speaking of Twitter, I just saw just yesterday down in Kansas City, their transit authority down there announcing new destinations that can be accessed through this on-demand thing. They, you know, call it microtransit, but, you know, it's just one word for it. But essentially, you know, a shuttle that, you know, takes me directly to that destination in Johnson County, Kansas, very, you know, suburban, low-density area. And I know in Indianapolis, there's similar things. Can you guys, really everyone, including Aaron, can you speak on that in terms of, you know, where are those, you know, what's leading to these kinds of services? What is the net kind of impact on transit? Is this, you know, increasing ridership? I mean, what does that, you know, what does that mean for kind of transit in general? And I guess, what does that mean for ultimately users and people trying to access far-flung, you know, areas outside of city centers?
Well, I'll say for MCTS, yeah, that's definitely uh, something that we would love to do, especially more of. A while back, we had some routes identified as the job lines. We had received funding as a result of a lawsuit against the State Department of Transportation for the work that was being done on I-94. And so we had routes that were going to Waukesha County, Washington County, to job centers out there. But one of the challenges that we had, even though we had stops at certain locations, that some of our passengers then would say had to go a little further. And I think that's something that, hopefully as a regional issue, that we can examine and see how can we get funding for that last mile. Maybe it's vans or what have you, smaller vehicles. But yeah, we definitely need to look into more funding for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a challenging one. I mean, again, it's very difficult to serve highly sprawly suburban types of developments. Just inherently, they aren't designed to be well accessed by transit. Even if there's a bus stop, directly in front of the shopping center, just walking from the street to the store is a long walk. And here and other places that I've seen, I do think part of it is, part of it is going to be employer paying, or the property owners paying. So again, that's happening in some of the industrial areas here. Actually, 25 years ago, when I was living in Chicago and working in Deerfield, there was a shuttle bus system that connected to the Metro line on Lake Cook Road to all the area office parks that was underwritten by those office park owners and users. So I think some of it is going to have to be determined by the willingness of the people who are served by this to pay. Another issue that we have here, and which affects a lot of suburban areas, is just a lack of sidewalks. Indianapolis did a city-county merger in 1970, but all of the county areas were really developed prior to the advent of new regulations that mandate sidewalks on street frontage. So we have a lot of areas that don't have sidewalks. I mentioned how this purple line is putting in 6 miles of sidewalks. And so improving sidewalk coverage for us is one of the things that we're doing. One of the most interesting things that I found, and maybe something that could be explored in Milwaukee, in other cities as well, is the city of Indianapolis has moved towards a system they call inclusive incentives around economic development incentives to try to subsidize jobs. We're going to subsidize jobs. Let it be jobs that are going to pay a living wage or better pay, contribute to equity in some way. And one of the first awards of that under the inclusive incentives was actually money that went to a company that's going to be located near that purple line BRT corridor. But the money is actually going to be used to improve sidewalks and connectivity of that company to the transit. So I think looking at some of the economic incentive policies and things, and can we use some of our incentive dollars to better get transit connectivity rather than just straight up giveaways, I think would be an interesting one to look at.
Great, thank you. So one of the central, I'd add that, one of the central things that everyone wants and everyone deserves is to feel safe. And, now there's perception and then there's reality. There's perception and then there's data. Now, my perception as a rider of the Milwaukee County Transit System and the streetcar and other systems around the US is I actually feel safer doing that than I would walking or riding my bike through most of the places I go, because the bus drivers, especially in Milwaukee, are typically bosses who are very much in control of what happens on that bus, and that gives you a feeling of safety and security. But that's my perception based on who I am and my own experience. Not everyone has the same experience or that same perception. And then there's the data around, how safe are these services? Everyone deserves to feel safe and secure everywhere that they go, no matter what mode they're using to get there. So can we speak on the safety aspect, both the data, the reality, and the perception of such, of the safety of the bus system in Milwaukee, the safety of regional transportation in our area, and just kind of what we know, Aaron, nationally about different modes and both the perception and the reality of safety for the users.
Yes. Well, safety is our number one concern, priority, period, for our passengers and especially our operators. And like you said, Dave, it's more than, how can I put it? It's more than a perception. I know that we have had issues from time to time. But let's just face it. Sometimes the outside world comes into our inside world, and then we have to deal with it. And that's why we have security cameras on all our bus to help capture if someone is doing something, be able to give the appropriate footage, so we can get help from law enforcement. And the law enforcement, they're great partners too. We also have security on our buses and the security points, and so we do all that to keep our people safe. And I think there's probably as certain parts of the city that some of our routes go through. Again, we have the outside world coming onto the inside world, and if we can, I guess, as a society, help address those issues that bring those the outside issues onto the bus, I think that would definitely help with safety overall. But that is something that we usually do quite well, consistently high over the years. And like you said, I think we've even done surveys and with our customers, and they have gave us high marks on how safe they felt. But safety is something that we all work together on, our employees, law enforcement, and as well the company as a whole.
Thank you.
Specifically for the East-West BRT project, safety has always been a big concern, especially with anyone coming to public meetings, any stakeholders we've met with, even coordination with City of Milwaukee, City of Wauwatosa, any of the project partners that we've talked to, MRMC, for example. So those are all considerations and have done a great deal for how the design of the stations, whether we're having cameras, making sure they're well lit, making sure that they're very transparent. Also, MCTS has made a huge effort to understand those concerns and make sure that whether it's maintenance or providing the right sort of staff, as Jacqueline was referring to, are of the utmost importance for future services.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add on that. I don't. I'm not an expert on public safety on that. So.
Great. Okay, so I'll have one last question before I open it up to the floor. And this being the Zoom era, I just allowed every attendee to talk. So that would be similar to me opening up the floor up to questions in real life. But before we do that, I want to ask the $64,000 question. And that is, where do we see ourselves in 6 months, with this whole, COVID-19 pandemic and its impact upon public transit. Now, originally last spring, the theme of our conference was looking into the future of Southeastern Wisconsin transit. And it's really hard to, look 6 years ahead or 10 years ahead when you don't know what's going to happen 6 or 10 months from now. So really, really near term. Obviously, none of us are public health experts here. But given where, everything is kind of headed financially and with this pandemic crisis, just very briefly, what should we be the most kind of focused on in the very near term?
Well, definitely in the very near term, our focus is on building back ridership. We're at 50% of what we have been, say, a year ago, normally at this time. And so that a lot of that is going to be, letting people know about the safety steps that we're taking. We're doing things like making hand sanitizer dispensers and mask dispensers available on all of our buses. Communicating how we're doing extra sanitization while we clean the buses, and just giving them that type of safety message. As a matter of fact, we're going to be part of the American Public Transportation Association's Health and Safety Commitment Program. So we're going to be rolling out and kind of like a seal of approval to let the public know that they can get back on board and resume their bus travel. But other things that we're going to be emphasizing is, letting people know that, remember that how we can provide access to where they want to go in terms of bus travel, connections, remind them how much they have been saving money. A lot of people are realizing that, hey, with not having my car, using my car often, I'm saving money. Well, they can do the same thing by taking the bus, not to worry about the stress of traffic, all those, like this gas and insurance payments. This remind them what a great deal that we are, and we can get them to where they need to be in a very timely fashion all around Milwaukee County. So it's going to be messages like that, and just confirming that as we emerge from this pandemic, that we're here for them and they can trust and rely on us just as they had in the past. And one thing for sure that we're from this pandemic is that in terms of essential workers, we know that we're an essential service, but for our essential workers, we know that we should look into improvements in funding for some of those areas that we've seen that could use more support. Like, for instance, our Purple Line, we saw a lot of people who are maybe coming from our north side, going to job centers along that route. So we're going to give that further attention, because coming out of COVID-19, we see even more so where our customers need us most.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. What I'll say first, I actually responded to a couple of the questions people asked me in the chat window. So if you want to look, you can look at that. You can see the answer I dropped in there. I do think it's going to be a little bit of a recovery period for transit ridership. If you look back, for example, I think it was 1983 that Philadelphia had a major transit strike that went on for several months. It took a couple decades, 2-3 decades, to build back ridership from that. We're obviously not in a strike situation, but I mean, similar things happened with like professional sports like strikes and lockouts. It took a while for kind of the fans to come back after that, and we have had an unprecedented disruption that I think it will take some time for people to go back on. A day or two ago, the Financial Times, which is essentially the London equivalent of the Wall Street Journal, did a big article on foot traffic in British cities. And what they basically found a pretty good relationship between foot traffic in cities and places that had, as a share of what it used to be, relative to the amount of public transit ridership in that city. So London, which had the highest public transit ridership, had the lowest share of its foot traffic having been recovered, whereas some of the cities that had never had as much transit ridership were doing better. So I do think, justified or unjustified, I think that the reality is there is a little bit of a unique, there is a little bit of fear that people have around being in, a bus with a lot of people in this environment. And so, I think that Jacqueline was exactly right in terms of restoring public confidence is important. Hopefully we'll get a vaccine. I mean, I'm hoping for that we'll do that. And I think the other thing is downtown employment, making sure that downtowns are able to get back open for business, getting those, getting the hospitality sector back, the travel sector back, the white collar workers back. That's going to account for a lot of what's going to happen with transit ridership in a lot of cities, because that's the place that is the concentrated transit-oriented job center in your market. And so a big focus on, kind of rebuilding downtowns as well, I think is going to be an important one.
Great. Thank you.
And
So we have Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
And just to add on here quickly, while there's so many unknowns going on with the pandemic, the goal of MCTS in Milwaukee County from the beginning of the East-West BRT project was to get the first East-West BRT in the state of Wisconsin, to get battery electric buses started in here as a directive from the Milwaukee Board of Supervisors. And while there are these unknowns, we're also staying flexible in order to meet the demands of the federal process and in order to get this efficient transit service here for the city of Milwaukee and to really move things forward. A great example is with our, there's a risk review process through the CIG program with the FTA that MCTS went through in early July. It was the first of its kind in terms of doing it in a virtual environment, but the number of resources and different items that our team pulled together were pretty amazing in terms of being flexible and making sure that we're still pushing all the buttons and staying aggressive. And frankly, with the pandemic, it's helped us to focus a little bit more on that and to look longer term of when we come out of this, how we're going to end up.
Thank you. So we have 2 minutes left until the end of our event at 9:30, and I think we have time for one very brief question. So if anyone has, I did open it up, to the floor. So if anyone has any, burning questions for Aaron, Mike, or Jacqueline, you can go ahead and ask it now. So I'll give you about 10 seconds to intervene or to chime in. Going once, going twice. Oh, go ahead.
No, I just, since I didn't see a question, I'll just throw one thing out there. One of the nice things about BRT, I've noticed when I travel to cities that I'm not familiar with, I often ride trains, but I don't ride buses very often. And that's because I don't necessarily, I go to the train station, there's a map, there's a fare machine. I can figure out how the system works before I try to board it. Whereas if I try to board a bus, I feel like I look like an idiot. I don't know where it's going. I don't know how much the fare is, all that stuff. And so I think there is an intimidation factor to the casual user of the bus in some places. And this is what BRT dramatically overcomes because it's functionally a rail network in that regard. You'll go to the station, you'll see the stops and the routes just like a rail network. You could get your fare. It's going to be like, you don't have to feel like you're going to look like an.
I think we may have